Hi, welcome to Intelligent Talk, intelligenttalk.com. We're very pleased to have with us today Ambassador David Stewart. Ambassador Stewart is a former South African ambassador to the United Nations, a former chief of staff to President F.W. de Klerk, the last white South African president, and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela. Ambassador Stewart, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you. So I just wanted to do a brief and sort of inartful analysis of the history. You gave me that YouTube video that you had done, which I found very helpful, and I researched a little bit on the South African history. So I thought I would just do a brief for the audience. A lot of people may not know very much about South Africa. It was founded by the Dutch in the 17th century. They were then displaced by the British in the 19th century. There were two Boer Wars against the British. The so-called Great Trek saw Afrikaners going into the inland, and that's basically the root of the Dutch white Afrikaners. As you said, Ambassador Stewart, more people had fought during the Boer War than any other conflict that the British had between, I believe, Napoleon and World War I. Is that correct?
That's quite right.
Yeah, so may I ask you, so you started your career in the Foreign Service, is that correct?
That's right, and a long time ago, I'm afraid.
What, in the 1950s or?
1966.
1956. And what countries were you stationed to before the United Nations?
Well, I spent my first posting in Australia, in Canberra, and my second posting I was in Ottawa, in Canada.
Okay. And then at age 37, you go to the United Nations, right? You're the South African ambassador to the UN?
That is correct.
And you very modestly said no one else wanted the job, but I'm sure that's not correct. I mean, must have been a plum assignment to get the ambassadorship.
Well, it was a very uncomfortable assignment because we were the most unpopular country in the world by a long way.
Right. And how long were you ambassador for the United Nations for?
Well, I was at the UN for about 4.5 years, and I was ambassador for 2 of those years.
2 of those years, okay. Could you tell me when you met President de Klerk?
Strangely enough, I met him for the first time in Chicago. He was attending a conference there, and I had flown across from New York. So, strangely enough, I met him for the first time in the United States.
Around what year was that?
That would have been, I guess, around 1981.
1981, okay. And President de Klerk becomes president in 1989, I believe, right? President Botha has a stroke, then he becomes president?
Yeah, he became acting president on the 15th of August, 1989, and he was elected president after our election on the 6th of September, 1989.
And when were you appointed as chief of staff? Was that right from the very beginning?
Well, no. To start with, I was assisting the president with his communication. I was then the head of our internal communication agency, and in that capacity I worked quite closely with the president for a couple of years, and then in 1992 he invited me to be his chief of staff. Got
it. Okay. Well, I just want to go back to the sort of the 1980s, if I could. In the area of, as you said, there were sanctions against South Africa. It was a difficult time. There was a communist insurgency in Angola and Zambia, and I want to get into that with you. But I just first want to get into what led to basically the negotiations with Mandela, because you had written that it wasn't necessarily the sanctions that did it, because in some ways you said the sanctions were a plus because South Africa had the 5th or the 6th largest arms producer in the world, correct?
Yeah, sanctions always has unintended consequences. So one of the unintended consequences was that because there was an arms embargo against us, we developed a very large armaments industry, and very ironically, armaments were one of our major exports.
Okay. So, and also you said also that there was a state of emergency in 1986, and you said also the state of emergency actually had calmed things down and produced calm. Is that correct too?
It was absolutely essential because there had been very high revolutionary expectations before the state of emergency. And the goals of the state of emergency were to restore order, to restore services, and to create an environment that would be conducive to constitutional negotiations. So we believe that it was absolutely essential to restore order and to get the message across that there wasn't going to be an armed solution to our problems, either by way of a successful revolution or by way of indefinite repression of the majority of the population.
Okay. I alluded to this earlier, but could you please discuss the military situation facing South Africa? Because in the interview I read, you mentioned a serious conflict in 1988 between basically South African and Cuban forces, which South Africa had won. I don't think also a lot of people who are younger today realize the situation, which there was essentially an insurgency against you in Namibia. There was a communist troops in Angola. There was ANC bases in Zambia against you. Could you just discuss the security situation overall, please, in the 1980s?
Well, the situation was that during the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union was really conducting surrogate wars against the West and third world countries. There was a stalemate in Europe, but the Soviet Union thought that it would be able to exploit the situation in Southern Africa and various parts of Asia, and also in various parts of Central America. And it made a particularly heavy investment in Southern Africa because it perceived that South Africa was increasingly isolated and that it would be a great target of opportunity. So when the Portuguese empire collapsed in 1974, the Soviets very quickly came to the aid of one of the Angolan parties called the MPLA, which was basically communist in its orientation. And they then sent in strong reinforcements to ensure that the MPLA would win the elections that took place in 1975. And this was to the great concern of half of the countries in the Organization of African Unity. And some of those countries asked South Africa to invade Angola to help the non-MPLA movements like the FLNA and UNITA in the south. South Africa did this, and our forces were just outside of Rwanda when the United States withdrew its support for this operation. So we had to return to our forces to the neighboring territory of Namibia, which we had ruled since 1915 under a contested League of Nations mandate. So for the following 10 years, 12, 13 years, there was low-intensity warfare in southern Angola as the Angolan forces tried to support the liberation movement of Namibia in their cross-border attacks against Namibia. And our forces were there to try and stop them. And this came to a crisis in September, October 1987, because I think the Soviets and the Angolans and the Cubans, there were 50,000 Cuban troops in Angola at the time, decided that they were going to launch a major attack against the headquarters of the UNITA movement, which was opposing them and which had contested the elections against them. And to reach the capital of UNITA, which was a place called Jamba in the southeast of the country, they had to cross the Lomba River. And UNITA forces and our forces stopped them at the Battle of the Lomba River, and it was quite a devastating defeat for the Angolans, the Cubans, and the Soviets, because the Soviets were very closely involved in the running of the campaign. The South African forces destroyed 93 Soviet tanks, or Soviet-built tanks, which was perhaps one of the biggest tank battles fought in Africa since the Second World War. It also destroyed an entire Angolan brigade of 5,000 men. So it was a very big-scale battle, and it really changed the whole balance of forces in Southern Africa, because after that, I think the Russians under Gorbachev began to lose interest in their adventures in Southern Africa. They had spent a lot of money on this. Gorbachev was trying to prop up the Soviet Union. He'd introduced his policies of glasnost and perestroika, and he couldn't afford these expensive and unsuccessful foreign adventures any longer. So the Russians, the Soviets, told the Angolans and the Cubans that they would have to reach an agreement with South Africa. And this happened in 1988. There was a tripartite agreement between South Africa, Angola, and Cuba relating to the withdrawal of those 50,000 Cuban troops from Angola, and then the simultaneous implementation of a UN independence plan for the territory of Namibia, just south of Angola. So it was a win-win situation. It meant that South Africa could extract itself from Namibia, that Namibia could become independent under a proper system with a proper constitution, and it meant that the Soviet threat in Southern Africa would disappear.
Now, Jonas Savimbi was the leader of the anti-communist Angolan forces. I think you were quite close to him. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I knew him very well.
Yeah. Now,
and he was a very impressive leader. The secret to Angolan politics was just looking at the surnames of the leaders of the different movements. All of the surnames of the MPLA were Portuguese. They came from the mixed Portuguese-Angolan bureaucracy that took over when the Portuguese left. The surnames of the guys from UNITA were all African. So it was there was a little bit of a cultural dimension in the struggle as well.
Okay. I want to turn to Mandela, but I just wanted to say, so it's fair to say that if it hadn't been for the collapse of the Soviet Union and South Africa's defeat of these communist forces, the groundwork for releasing Mandela and probably having the peace negotiations might not have occurred. Is that fair to say, or would it maybe occurred at a different time?
That's absolutely correct, because one of our great concerns throughout this period was the influence of the South African Communist Party on the African National Congress. The South African Communist Party had managed to establish a very, very strong relationship with the ANC. It had drafted most of its basic doctrines and ideologies, and it controlled the ANC's armed wing. And we were also very concerned because virtually all of the members of the ANC's National Executive Committee were also members of the South African Communist Party. And we knew that the South African Communist Party favored what they called a two-phase revolutionary process, in terms of which the first part of the revolution would be what they called the national liberation, under the aegis of the National Liberation Movement, which was the ANC, after which the Communist Party would become what they called the Vanguard Party and lead the country on to full communism. And we weren't too keen on this.
Right. Now, Joe Slovo, who was he? He was in the South African Communist Party, correct?
Yeah, Joe Slovo was a white member of the South African Communist Party. He was involved in the armed wing of the ANC. He had a senior position in the armed wing, which was called Mkhonto weSizwe.
Okay. So just for everyone, so now I want to just turn to, if I could, to President de Klerk and your relationship with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was, of course, the head of the ANC. President de Klerk lets him out of jail in 1990. I remember that very well. I was in college at the time. It was obviously worldwide news. It was a time of hope. What you mentioned in the book that you wrote with President de Klerk, The Last Trek, you mentioned a side of Mandela which I found sort of interesting. I mean, I think everyone has respect for President Mandela, but there was a certain bitterness that you saw, having been in jail for 27 years. And, for example, when President de Klerk wants to have his residence renovated, Mandela insists upon seeing it to see if it was really necessary to renovate it. Could you discuss some of the tensions between President de Klerk and Mandela?
Yeah, the fact is that they were leaders of opposing parties locked in negotiations on the future of South Africa. So there were often very, very stormy interactions between them. But the really critical thing was that whenever it was necessary, they were able to come together to resolve deadlocks in the talks and to make sure that we could move ahead to the adoption of our new constitution. And there were still niggling bits along the way. One of them was the question of the residences that the various senior political office bearers would have after the introduction of the new government. Mr. Mandela was, of course, a president, and de Klerk was a deputy, one of two deputy presidents in the government of national unity. But it was actually not a major issue for de Klerk. It was just one of those sort of niggling things that happens in politics.
And I know that Nelson Mandela came to President de Klerk's 70th birthday party, I think at the Mount Nelson Hotel in Cape Town, which I stayed at years ago, so I know they finished up as good friends. But just to go back to that area, the tension between de Klerk and Mandela, was one of the main tensions the fighting between the Inkatha Zulu Party and the ANC. The Zulu Party was Chief Buthelezi, who's still there today, and Mandela was made the allegation that the government was funding Inkatha to try to create turmoil amongst Black Civil War. Was that the main tension between the two of them, or one of the main tensions?
Well, the main conflict arose not because of anything that the government of F.W. de Klerk had done, but because the ANC was trying to move into the political territory controlled by the more conservative Inkatha Freedom Party. And this really flared into a low-level civil war. And in the process, more than 400 of the Inkatha Freedom Party leaders were assassinated. And I think various elements in the South African Defence Force then provided secret assistance to Inkatha without the knowledge of President de Klerk and against his specific instructions. So that was one of the crises that we had to deal with during de Klerk's presidency, when it was revealed that elements of the defense forces were still assisting the Inkatha Freedom Party. But de Klerk took decisive steps to make sure that this was stopped.
Okay. Could I just ask now about the nuclear weapons? South Africa is a very unique case. It's the only country in the world to build nuclear weapons and then dismantle them on their own volition. Places like Ukraine had nuclear weapons that were built by the Russians, and they gave them back. But South Africa organically built nuclear weapons and then dismantled them. You said in an interview you gave that they had 6.5 and nuclear weapons. Could you describe to me the process of why the nuclear weapons were built and why they were dismantled?
Well, the decision to build the nuclear weapons was taken in the 1970s, I think, because of the collapse of the Portuguese Empire and the arrival of the Soviet Union in Southern Africa. South Africa did not enjoy the protection of any nuclear weapons power as Canada or Australia or countries in Western Europe did. And so it felt that under these circumstances it was necessary to try to develop its own deterrent. But in fact, it was not really a credible deterrent because the use of nuclear weapons in bush wars made no sense at all. And it would have been unthinkable to use nuclear weapons against the capitals of any of our neighboring states. So when de Klerk came to power, to office as president in 1989, one of the first things he did was to cancel this program, firstly because the threat from the Soviet Union had disappeared, secondly because the decisions that he was going to take with regard to the release of Nelson Mandela and the commencement of constitutional negotiations would, he knew, resolve all the outstanding problems between South Africa and its neighbors in Southern Africa. And thirdly, the program was expensive, so it made absolutely no sense to keep the nuclear weapons. So de Klerk, as one of the first decisions he took early in his presidency was to instruct that the weapons be dismantled, and we then entered into a full agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Okay. I'm going to ask you two questions you may not be able to comment on, but I'll just ask them. There's been books written that basically said Israel helped South Africa with their nuclear program, and number two, that there was a test that South Africa did off the coast in 1979 that was picked up by a U.S. satellite. Do you have anything you can comment on either of those two things?
Well, this was never really proved. There was a great deal of speculation about it, and I was in the room when all of the people involved in the program denied to President de Klerk that there had been any relationship with Israel in developing nuclear weapons,
okay,
and denied that there had been a test over the Southern Atlantic. But then again, people don't always tell the truth to presidents, so I really don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Just if I could turn to where we are today, President de Klerk has said that he's still optimistic in spite of the problems, and some of the problems that obviously you know better than myself, but there were allegations of corruption by President Zuma, who's now been replaced, but he was the last president of South Africa for a number of years, and he was supposedly funneling projects to the Gupta family and doing other things with his children, and also a house that he had renovated and paid a lot of money. And now the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has an ally named David Mabuza, who's widely seen as not honest, and there's record crime and there's problems with HIV. But in spite of the problems of South Africa today, are you still optimistic on the future, like President de Klerk?
Well, I think the first point is that the situation in South Africa today, with all of our problems, is a lot better than it was before 1994, and it's certainly a lot better than it would have been if we had not taken the decisions that we took in 1994 to enter into negotiations with all of the people of South Africa and to create our present constitutional democracy. So the good news is that we do have a strong constitution, we have a free political system, We're going to have our next elections next year. They will be free and fair. We have independent courts. We have very outspoken and free media. So in many respects, or in fact all respects, we are a functioning multi-party democracy. However, we have taken all of the wrong decisions in important policy areas. To start with, we have failed a whole generation of kids by providing one of the worst education systems in the world, even though it's quite expensive. Secondly, we've followed the wrong economic policy since 2007, and our economy is hardly growing. As a result, we have catastrophically high unemployment. The official figure is 27%. The expanded figure is around 37%, but the reality is that only about 40% of people between the ages, or black South Africans, between the ages of 16 and 65 are working, which is a very, very low labor absorption rate. So we've failed to address the problems of inequality in our society. Although our new constitution commits us to the achievement of equality, we are a less equal society today than we were in 1994. So we have immense challenges, and one of the challenges is increasing the vitriolic race relations. The old days of the reconciliation that Nelson Mandela worked so hard to achieve are unfortunately something of the past. So we're wrestling with all of these problems, but the situation is a lot better than it was in 1994. We're still a functioning democracy, a free society, but in many respects we're going in the wrong direction.
Would you say, Ambassador Stewart, that an example of going in the wrong direction is what the ANC did recently with Julius Malema, where they try to basically go to the left of him and they say, well, we're going to now confiscate white-owned property without compensation, sort of like they did in Zimbabwe? And
exactly. I think this is one of the main concerns. There are a lot of people in our government who really think that Venezuela is a great example, believe it or not. So we have to combat wild and wacky ideologists. Some of them still strongly influenced by the South African Communist Party.
Okay. I don't know if you saw that last night. President Trump sent a tweet about this one. The question I'm going to ask you now, but basically he said that there are stories of these white farmers under attacks. As I understand it, the number of white farm deaths has actually gone down about 50% over the last few years, from about 100 a year to something like 50 a year. But Trump sent a tweet about this just yesterday. But the attacks on the white farms, do you see those as politically motivated, or that's just random crime, in your opinion?
It's a little bit of both, because our previous president actually sang a song saying that we should all kill the farmers. And for whichever way you want to look at that, that is going to give criminals the idea that it's open season on farmers. And so the murder rate among farmers has been exceptionally high. Whether it is coordinated or organized remains to be seen. It hasn't been proved yet. But it is a very serious situation.
That song you're talking about, is that the song where they say "kill the boar"? Is that the song? Sort of the ANC song?
That's the song, yeah.
Even Nelson Mandela sang that song, I believe it. You can see it on YouTube, actually. So.
Yeah, but he may have sung it as a sort of an old liberation song.
Right.
President Zuma said that the cabinet was going to shoot the Boers, which means that sort of it wasn't a liberation front because they didn't have a cabinet when they were fighting it during the war. So it is disturbing, and under any circumstances, it's unacceptable to say or sing songs that you're going to kill anybody.
Yeah, yes, of course. Look, I just want to ask you about something else which is in the news recently in South Africa, if I could, and I'm sure you know much more about it than I do, but there's a book written called The Lost Boys of Bird Island that made the allegation that the Secretary, basically of Defense of South Africa, Mallon, had a pedophile ring that he was using South African military to bring in children to an island where he was having these affairs, and the co-author of the book was recently died, and the allegation is maybe he was killed. Do you have any comment on that kind of story?
Yeah, these reports are very shocking, but they still remain allegations, and F.W. de Klerk has called on our authorities to investigate them thoroughly. The reality is that in any government, you're going to get aberrant people. You've had a couple of presidents who've had pretty wild sexual appetites themselves.
Yes, President Kennedy.
But you get this sort of thing all over the world as individuals and what have you. De Klerk made the point that this was in no way a reflection on the people that he had worked with in general. And the allegations must still be proved.
Okay. Let me ask you about one more allegation, if I could. I'm sure you heard about Eugene de Kock and the allegations of Unit C-10. And Eugene said he killed something like 100 people on a farm outside of Pretoria. Do you believe that probably occurred? And was that obviously also just an example of just maybe not enough supervision of the South African security forces that could occur?
No, that has been, I think, pretty well proved in our courts. And de Kock served a very, very long prison sentence for that. He was in charge of an illegal unit within the South African police that carried out irregular actions against ANC guerrillas, and in the process, many of them were killed in an extrajudicial manner. So it was something that was quite unacceptable under any circumstances. And again, it is something that de Klerk tried to combat. He was informed about these things only a month or so before the 1994 elections by a commission of inquiry that he himself had instituted called the Goldstone Commission.
Okay. Yes, and to the credit of the South African government, they've actually released Eugene de Kock because he went before the Truth and Reconciliation Committee under Bishop Tutu and confessed his crimes, and as I understand it, he's actually been released.
Yeah, he's been released, I think, because he'd served out his term. He did not qualify for amnesty in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation process because many of the crimes that he committed on his own account and not as part of any kind of political struggle. And that was the requirement for amnesty. And many of the crimes were also egregious, completely out of proportion to any objective, rational objective.
Okay. Can I go back? There was a vote in 1992 where basically it was just a white-only vote where there was the decision made to allow President de Klerk to dismantle apartheid, which obviously de Klerk won that vote. If that vote had not been won, do you think President de Klerk would have resigned, and what would have been the future of the government had that not gone his way?
Well, he would have had to have resigned and called an election, and it's very likely that a right-wing party would have won that election. But de Klerk had confidence in the majority of white South Africans that they would continue with the negotiation process, which they did. It was a victory by 69%. And one must remember that one isn't talking here of a minority as such. White South Africans, and particularly Afrikaners, regarded themselves as a separate nation who happened to be caught up in the geographic area that the Brits had mapped out in 1910. And so for white South Africans, it was a question of taking the enormous risk of giving up their right to national self-determination. And that was really what the crux of the negotiations was all about.
Did you ever think, when you were in the negotiations with Mandela and de Klerk, by the way, your opinion of Mandela, did you like him personally? Did you find him a very charming, charismatic person? Or?
But Mandela is undoubtedly one of the most impressive people I've ever met in my life.
Right.
Without a doubt. And I've met a lot of presidents and prime ministers and what have you. But he was really in a class of his own, a man of incredible charm, of wonderful bearing, great dignity, a great reconciler after he became president. He was an exceptionally remarkable man. I remember on my 50th birthday getting a telephone call out of the blue, and it was Mandela, and he said, "Oh, Dave, now you're 50. Now you're a real man." Which was really such a nice gesture. I mean, I was never on his side. I was always one of his opponents. But he had just incredible personal charm. And he really went out of his way to make everybody he came across feel special.
Right, like when he went to Orania, that white settlement, and he had tea with the person whose husband...
Exactly, when he went to see the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, who had been the main architect of apartheid.
Right, exactly. I mean, yeah, just incredible charm to do that, and lack of any ill will towards... So, was there any time when you would, in these negotiations between Mandela and de Klerk, that you thought things would not turn out well, or were you pretty confident that it was going to be a happy conclusion?
No, it was like a roller coaster ride the whole way, up and down. We didn't know at all that it was going to be successful, right until the very end. And in fact, the roller coaster nearly came off the tracks in June 1992, when the ANC decided to withdraw from the negotiations. And they thought, well, look, they're having to make too many concessions in the negotiations. Maybe it would be better if they did what they called the Leipzig option. If they could get enough people out in the streets and demonstrating and striking for long enough, as the East Germans had done just a year or two before, then the South African government would collapse, as the East German government had collapsed, and they wouldn't have to go through all of these painful negotiations. But of course, it didn't work.
Right, yes. So, just in conclusion, then, obviously, you said it's still fair to say you're fairly optimistic on the future in spite of the problems, as President de Klerk is, correct?
Yes. The interesting thing about South Africa is that everybody who's visited South Africa since 1652 has said, "Oh, this is a lovely place, but it can't possibly last another 5 years." And we're still here. And It is a lovely place.
Right. Okay, well, Ambassador Stewart, I just want to say thank you so much for your time today. It was very interesting, and thank you so much for speaking with us.
That's a great pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Right, bye.
Hi, I'm Janice Ian. Do you remember how excited you were at the start of summer every year, and how the summer just started to drag on after a few months, and you couldn't wait to get back to school, see your old friends, make new friends, get new books and a new locker and a clean slate? Well, you should have been excited about music class, too, because that was a special room where you went to sing, perform with your friends, and learn all kinds of interesting stuff about great composers, instruments, different kinds of music and songs. We remember our music teachers because they were so passionate about helping us learn to love music. They helped to spark a love for listening to notes and voices and rhythms that continues to enrich our lives even today. I bet your kids feel the same way about music class. Ask them, and make sure they get involved with music in school and in their lives.
A PSA brought to you by MENC, the National Association for Music Education, and the National Anthem Project, the campaign to restore America's voice through music education. Music, part of a sound education.